history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My
Welcome to Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man. I'm Stephen Leake. Tonight, propaganda from World War I to the present day. I begin with a question that has haunted this land since its birth. What is freedom? Who decides what it means? Not the word, but the feeling. That electric pulse that runs through the American imagination. That conviction that itself belongs to no one but itself. It is our national religion, our civic heartbeat, our myth of origin and destiny both. And yet the irony is cruel and enduring. No nation has spoken more of freedom while wrestling so long with its contradictions. No people have spoken so loudly of liberty while learning again and again how fragile it truly is. Freedom, in the American sense, this peculiar hybrid of enlightenment reasoning and frontier of individualism, was not discovered, it was constructed. It was imagined, written, printed, sold, and defended, in pamphlets, in pulpits, in blood. It is not a natural law carved into the human soul. It is a story we have told ourselves so often that we mistake it for the truth. The early architects of that story, Jefferson, Madison, Franklin, and Hamilton, were philosophers and propagandists both. They wrote not just to govern, but to persuade. They knew that revolutions are not won merely with muskets, but with narratives that make men believe the struggle is holy. When Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, he was crafting one of the most effective propaganda lines in human history. A line so simple, so radiant, so universal, that it could unite farmers, merchants, radicals, and skeptics, even men who did not yet fully believe it themselves. That phrase, that elegant fiction, did not describe America, it invented it. So from the beginning, freedom in the American imagination was not just a condition to be defended, but an idea to be sold. It was a banner, a dream, an export, and a mirror in which the young republic saw its reflection and its aspirations. But let's not confuse rhetoric with reality. While Jefferson wrote his immortal words, 5,000 men in Virginia remained his property. While the Continental Congress debated liberty, enslaved people built the very plantations that paid for their powdered wigs. So the American notion of freedom was born not pure but paradoxical, a gospel of self-determination whispered over the chains of others. So it's always been this thing, this paradox. It was an ideal to aspire to and not a truth. Yet perhaps this tension, that collision between ideal and hypocrisy, is what gave American freedom its ferocious vitality. Because from the start, to be American meant to live in permanent argument with yourself. Freedom was not merely granted, it was performed. It was a posture, a declaration, a way of standing in the world. And that performance, over time, became its own kind of theater. The theater of persuasion, self-justification of myth-making. It is from that theater that the propaganda in the American form eventually emerged, not as a crude weapon of totalitarianism, but as the velvet instrument of democracy itself. A persuasion so deep and continuous that it feels like consent. Let me trace the line back. Long before Edwin Bernays and Walter Lippmann gave propaganda its modern name, long before Madison Avenue learned to sell desire like salvation, the American Revolution itself was a campaign of influence. Think of the pamphleteers, Thomas Paine writing common sense, not for kings but for farmers. He didn't appeal to their reason alone. He appealed to their pride, their resentment, their longing for moral clarity. He didn't teach them new facts. He gave them a story in which they were heroes. Every revolution is a story that persuades the people to believe they deserve more than they have. So I'm going to light one up and tell you the story I believe. The story of how we get away and change these truths into something true and get away from performative propaganda, something that the elites use to rule over us, to our own truth. As Paine was perhaps the first great American ad man, selling liberty like a product whose time had come, the colonial printer was the ancestor of propaganda, the broadsheet, the ancestor of the press release. And so even before the public was founded, the mechanics of persuasion was the lifeblood of its creation. Freedom, in other words, was never separate from propaganda. It was born through it. Consider that paradox, that the same skills used to convince men of their liberty would one day be used to convince them they were still free, even when they were not. That, I think, is the American condition. A people perpetually persuaded of their own autonomy. By the 19th century, the American sense of freedom had become something more than a political principle. It had become a moral posture, a personality, and a brand. Tocqueville, traveling through his young and restless nation, saw it clearly. He wrote that Americans were restless in the midst of abundance, forever chasing after something that eluded them, forever convinced that freedom was not merely the absence of tyranny, but the endless multiplication of choices. He saw that for Americans, freedom was not stillness, it was motion, not harmony, but competition, not equality, but the dream of equality. And that dream would become the most persuasive force on earth, because even when a nation defines freedom as desire, then every act of persuasion becomes an act of liberation. Every product, every candidate, every ideology can be sold as freedom's new face. This, more than any constitution or court, became America's real constitution, the invisible law of the marketplace of emotion. Freedom was that one product no one dared critique. To question it was to risk exile from the American story. And by the time the 20th century dawned, propaganda was not merely an instrument of government, it was a way of life. Advertising became the cathedral of modern persuasion. It took the techniques once used to stir revolution and turned them into commerce. The slogans changed. Give me liberty or give me death became have it your way. The emotional logic was identical. Edward Bernays, Freud's nephew, understood this better than anyone, calling it engineering consent. He took Freud's insight into the unconscious, our buried desires, our insecurities, our hunger for belonging, and turned them into tools of mass influence. He wrote, quote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society," end quote. Bernays did not see propaganda as evil. He saw it as inevitable, even necessary, in a society where information was abundant, but attention was scarce. He believed democracy could not function unless the public could be guided, so he made persuasion a science. It's no coincidence that Bernays' early work was for corporations and governments alike. He sold them bacon as breakfast, cigarettes as emancipation, political consent as civic virtue. His campaigns blurred the line between want and will, between self-expression and social control. And Walter Lippmann, his intellectual counterpart, gave this system its philosophical spine. Lippmann argued that the average citizen was not capable of understanding the complexities of modern life. He believed democracy required an elite class of manufacturers of consent, an informed minority who could shape the illusions that kept the public coherent. To Lippmann, propaganda was not betrayal of democracy, it was its operating system. So here we find ourselves. By the mid 20th century, the American definition of freedom and the practice of propaganda were no longer adversaries. They were partners, locked in a dance of mutual dependence. Freedom became freedom to choose, but what we chose was what we were told to want. And then the more persuasive the system became, the freer we felt. That is the genius and the peril of American persuasion. It convinces us that to be influenced is to be empowered, that to consent is to be free, that to live within the invisible choreography of messaging and branding is to exercise our will. In the decades that followed, through wars, through television, through the glowing rise of screens, this fusion of freedom and propaganda became the psychological architecture of American life. Every war had its slogan, every brand had its creed, every citizen became a marketer of the self, and through it all, the myth persisted that we were the freest people on earth. Freedom, perhaps, became our greatest illusion precisely because it was our greatest need, and like all myths, it had to be maintained. That maintenance, that continuous reinforcement of belief, is what we now call propaganda. You may think I exaggerate. You may say, surely the people are not so easily led. But consider this. When Reagan spoke of a shining city upon a hill, he did not speak to reason, he spoke to imagination. He gave America a cinematic image of itself, luminous, righteous, chosen. He was not describing a place, he was projecting a feeling. That is the essence of persuasion in a democracy. Not the control of action, but the shaping of imagination. Reagan understood, as Jefferson once did, that freedom is not self-sustaining, it must be narrated. And whoever narrates freedom owns it. So this, my friends, is where the story begins. A nation founded on liberty, sustained by narrative, and seduced again and again by its own reflection. We have not yet reached the modern machinery of the NDAA, nor the sleek psychological warfare of 21st centuries. That will come. But before we descend into that labyrinth, we must first understand the temple at its entrance, the American faith in freedom, a faith so deep that even our chains are made to look like choices. Would you like me to... Freedom and persuasion, twin gods of the American century. And as the 20th century matured, their alliance deepened until one could not breathe without the other. For persuasion was no longer a means to liberty, it had become liberty's very expression. To be American was to be free to persuade, to speak, to sell, to broadcast, to brand and inspire. And in that sea of messages, truth became a matter of orchestration. Whoever could most beautifully arrange the noise could most convincingly claim to represent the truth. Let us enter the 20th century not as a parade of events, but as an evolution of technique. For what changed was not the dream of freedom, but the technology by which that dream was manufactured. When the radio arrived, the voice of the state could finally fill the private home. When the television was born, images of the state could colonize the mind. And with every new medium came a new style of propaganda, softer, subtler, more persuasive, precisely because it felt so personal. Edward Bernays, in his book Propaganda, in 1928, wrote that the invisible governors of society, quote, pull the wires which control the public mind, end quote. He said this not in warning, but in pride. He saw it as a mark of civilization and thought that it could be guided as efficiently as industry. His clients were presidents and corporations alike. His genius was to merge the language of civic virtue with the logic of consumer desire. He would stage elaborate events, debutantes lighting cigarettes in public to proclaim freedom for women, and within weeks tobacco sales would surge. He would persuade citizens that public relations was not deception, but democracy in motion. The result was that persuasion became invisible. Advertising no longer sold products, it sold identities. And politics, following its example, ceased to offer visions, it began to sell brands. In that grand binary, persuasion became policy. Advertising, media, education, film, radio, all enlisted, implicitly or explicitly, in the service of ideological coherence. Every Coca-Cola commercial, every Hollywood hero, every political speech became a node in the great network of influence that defined the 20th century mind. Freedom was not just defended, it was performed daily through consumption. To buy was to choose was to affirm liberty, and the market became the arena where democracy and desire merged. How perfect a system! A nation that need not silence its people, because its people have learned to sing the same tune voluntarily. This too is kind of genius. Reagan, decades later, would inherit the fruits of this system. He would not speak as a statesman, but as a storyteller, a man who knew that politics was no longer about governance, but about performance. He transformed the presidency into the pulpit of optimism. He spoke of morning in America, a phrase so simple, so luminous that it required no scrutiny. It felt true, and that was enough. He restored not the economy of liberty, but the aesthetic of liberty. Under his vision, freedom became the light itself, radiant, unquestionable, emotionally perfect. And in the glow of that light, the machinery of persuasion expanded unchallenged. During the Cold War, the United States developed vast psychological operational capabilities, not only for foreign adversaries, but for domestic morale. Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, USIA, and 1,000 quiet partnerships with media, film, and culture. Those were not lies, they were culture curated truths. Their purpose was not to deceive, but to direct, to ensure that the emotional compass of its citizens always pointed towards faith in America. And what is faith but propaganda perfected? A message that no longer feels like a message, a belief that sustains itself without proof. During these decades, the American citizen underwent a subtle transformation. He ceased to be a participant in the Republic and became instead a consumer of its narrative. Citizenship became spectator sports. One cheered, one bought, one voted, but rarely doubted. The power of persuasion is that it creates the illusion of choice where none exists. The propaganda of the Cold War was not overt. It did not demand obedience. It demanded loyalty. Loyalty is harder to measure, harder to question. It resides not in the mind, but in the gut. Television became the altar of that loyalty. And it was there that the family gathered nightly to be reminded who they were, not subjects, not victims, but the protagonists of history's moral drama. Every sitcom and commercial, every news broadcast reinforced the story. We are the free, they were the unfree. Our system works, theirs does not. And so freedom was a dangerous idea that inspired rebellion. It became a tranquilizing comfort, a mood, and a brand. It became something once felt, not something one fought for. And that transformation, though invisible, was monumental, because the people who believe they are free need never notice when they stop being so. Did you see the pattern? At every stage, persuasion has evolved, from the pamphlet to the poster, from the broadcast to the algorithm, but the emotional logic remains unchanged. The story of the self is sovereign, the citizen is chooser, the system is benevolent, and because the story flatters us, we protect it. We become its guardians, its enforcers, its amplifiers. That is the deepest trick of propaganda. It persuades its subjects to sustain it. Even Lippmann warned of this. He wrote in Public Opinion that democracy was a phantom public, a theater in which citizens believe they are participants, when in truth they are spectators to decisions already made. We saw the machinery of consent as necessary, but he saw its danger, that the architects might come to believe their own illusions, and so the 20th century matured. America became both the freest and most managed society on earth, not through censorship, but through saturation, not by silencing speech, but by flooding it. Freedom of speech, yes, but no guarantee of truth or clarity, or quiet enough to think. And in that noise, freedom began to dissolve into spectacle. Perhaps this was inevitable. A nation founded on persuasion could not help but evolve into a civilization of influencers. We are not victims of propaganda, we are its descendants, its artists, its inheritors. We have built cathedrals to it on every screen. We pray to it every time we say, believe me. We recreate it every time we post, perform, declare, or brand. Propaganda is not what the state does to us, it's what we do to ourselves in the name of freedom. But even this, the propaganda of consumer democracy, was but the prelude, because in the early 21st century something changed again. The machinery became aware of itself. The algorithms began to learn what we wanted before we knew it. And the state, armed with the tools of persuasion and surveillance, began to merge its narrative ambition with corporate power. That's why the story leads us to the NDAA, to Smith-Munt's modernization, to the legal quietness which the state reclaimed the right to shape our perceptions directly. Before we reach that moment, that turning point in 2013 when propaganda quietly became home, we must first look deeper into the psychological soil of America itself. We must understand why this land, above all others, has always been so ready to believe the story of its own freedom. Because what comes next is not merely history, it is diagnosis, the anatomy of how a free people learn to live inside persuasion, to call it liberty, and to defend it as virtue. And so, having peered into the mirror of belief, we turn now to the machinery that keeps the mirror polished, because stories, no matter how beautiful, require infrastructure. In the United States, that infrastructure, persuasion, has always worn the costume of law. Every empire codifies its illusions. Rome called them decrees, Britain called them charters, America calls them acts. From Cold War to Paper Shield. After the Second World War, Americans feared propaganda almost as much as they feared communism. The horror of Goebbels made the word toxic. The idea that the U.S. government might manipulate its own citizens seemed sacrilege, un-American. So in 1948, Congress passed the Smith-Mundt Act, meant to ensure that information created for foreign audiences could not be turned inward. Its logic was simple. The state may persuade abroad, but never at home. That law was a moral firewall, built from the conviction that truth inside the Republic should arise from competition, not command. It was imperfect, yes, but it was a line in the sand, a recognition that freedom of conscience required informational distance between the governors and the governed. Yet history has a way of softening prohibitions. During the Cold War, the government found ways to dance around its own boundaries. The United States Information Agency produced films, broadcasts, pamphlets, art exhibits, all designed to showcase American virtue to the world. Those materials inevitably drifted back across the border. Television signals do not respect geography, and once the public saw the polish of these productions, they wanted more. The line began to blur. Was a film made for Berlin still foreign? Was it played in Boston? Was the radio program aimed at Moscow somehow dangerous if a farmer in Kansas tuned in? Each exception became precedent. By the late 1970s, congressional oversight had weakened, and the firewall existed more in theory than in practice. The new century and the quiet repeal. Fast forward to the early 21st century. Terrorism had replaced communism as the omnipotent threat. The digital revolution had erased the borders that once gave Smith-Mundt its logic. Information flowed everywhere and nowhere, faster than law could follow. In 2013, within the pages of the National Defense Authorization Act, Congress inserted a brief, almost unnoticed revision, the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act. With a few sentences, it lifted the prohibition on domestic dissemination of materials produced for foreign audiences. No hearings, no national debate, just a quiet administrative convenience, at least on paper. Supporters argue that taxpayers deserve access to what their money funded abroad. Critics warn that it was a re-legalization of propaganda on American soil. Both were right. For the first time in 65 years, it became lawful for the U.S. government to aim its messaging, its psychological operations, its public diplomacy at its own citizens, not covertly, openly, institutionally, and with budget lines. The architecture was already built. The Global Engagement Center, the U.S. Agency for Global Media, an expanding web of contractors skilled in narrative warfare. All that changed was direction. The gun turned inward, not to kill, but to shape. Propaganda by another name. Of course, no official uses the word propaganda anymore. They call it strategic communication, counter disinformation, resilience messaging, public awareness campaigns. Each phrase carries a scent of virtue, but beneath the semantics lies a simple truth. The state has resumed the right to decide which stories its people should hear. It tells us this is necessary to fight foreign influence, to defend democracy, to protect truth itself. And perhaps it was partly true. The world of information had become a battlefield without front lines. Enemies whisper through memes and trolls. The rumors metastasize faster than reason. In such chaos, who would not want a guardian of truth? But the paradox is lethal. When the government becomes a curator of reality, democracy begins to mimic the system it swore to oppose. Imagine a circle of mirrors, each reflecting the next. In one stands a corporation, another the intelligence agency, another the platform that hosts the speech, another the algorithm that decides which words are seen. Each insists it serves freedom. Together they create a hall where the citizen only sees sanctioned reflections. That hall is being built now, quietly, legally, bureaucratically, under the banner of protection. The post-truth dilemma. Here lies the great irony of our age. We legalize propaganda not to spread lies, but to defend truth. We arm the storytellers because we no longer trust the story to defend itself. The digital deluge fractured our shared reality. Instead of repairing the civic fabric through education, patience, and dialogue, we reach for faster tools, narrative management, content moderation, behavioral nudging, soft power turned inward, marketed as public health. In doing so, we confirm Bernays' prophecy that the manipulation of opinion will become a permanent institution of democracy. And so each generation renews the illusion with new vocabulary. Liberty endures not as reality, but as brand integrity. Six, the present moment. Look around. Propaganda today does not march with banners. It streams, scrolls, pings. It tells you what your friends think, what your fears predict, what your neighbors approve. It is the background radiation of the digital republic. Every notification is a whisper. This is what matters. This is who you are. And behind those whispers stands networks funded, regulated, and quietly partnered with the same institutions that once promised to keep persuasion abroad. We have come full circle. The tools that forged to fight fascist lies now manage democratic emotions. The instruments of liberation have become the instruments of maintenance. But let us not sink into despair. Understanding it itself is itself resistance. The moment we name the mechanism, the spell weakens. The task before us is not to abolish persuasion, it cannot be done, but to reclaim consciousness within it. For freedom in this century will not be the absence of propaganda, it will be the ability to recognize it, to navigate it, to remain self aware amid its seductions. That perhaps is a new revolution, not muskets, not marches, but mindfulness in the face of manipulation. So here we end the first half hour of long meditation. We have walked from Jefferson's quill to Bernays' press release, from the Cold War's radio towers to the NDAA's. You can see how freedom and persuasion have danced together across the centuries, sometimes lovers, sometimes adversaries, always intertwined. To the hours ahead, we will go deeper still, to the philosophy of control, the algorithms of emotion, and the possible features of a nation mistakes guidance for grace. You and I were born inside an invisible. We do not remember its construction. Its pillars were raised long before our first. Its windows were made of screens. Its hymns or slogans and whispered in between advertisements. We call this cathedral freedom. We enter it every morning when we unlock our phones, when we choose between 1,000 identical brands of identity, when we scroll past the same promise dressed in 100 different costumes, and we believe sincerely, passionately, that each choice is ours, that every decision is a declaration of autonomy. But I ask you, if the architecture of your desire has been drawn by another, how free are you in your choosing? In the mid 20th century, psychologists and propagandists began to study this question, not as moral puzzle, but as practical challenge. They called it motivational research. They asked what makes modern self tick, what hidden levers drive a purchase, a vote, a loyalty. Ernest Dichter, one of Bernays' successors, said it bluntly. We must find the emotional key to every citizen's heart and turn it gently until it opens. This was not manipulation as we imagine it, crude lies or censorship. It was persuasion through resonance, a kind of emotional tuning. Find what the person already wants safety, belonging, status, transcendence, and amplify it. Give them the illusion of self expression while you supply the vocabulary. That principle, guided self expression, became the soul of American persuasion. From Madison Avenue to Pennsylvania Avenue, the logic was the same. People resist control, but they embrace affirmation. So do not command them, reflect them. Hold up a mirror that flatters, and they will love you for the illusion. This mirror, the American Grand Mirror, reflects a very specific myth, the myth of infinite choice. It is perhaps the most persuasive idea in modern history. It tells us that freedom consists not in the quality of our choices, but in their quantity. That the more options we have, the freer we become. That freedom can be measured by the number of channels on the television, the size of the mall, the variety of political slogans. But choice in this context is not liberty, it's distraction. A labyrinth built so wide that one forgets it has walls. Every advertisement, every algorithm, every party platform whispers the same promise. You may be whoever you wish, just choose. And so we choose endlessly, fanatically, frantically, without rest. We curate our tastes, our politics, our identities. We call this freedom, but it is in truth the perfect mechanism of control, a system that convinces us to govern ourselves according to its logic. Walter Lippmann foresaw this paradox. He wrote, quote, "The environment from which the individual must deal is pseudo-environment," quote unquote, a mental map constructed from symbols, images, and mediated impressions. We do not respond to reality, but to representations of reality. Whoever shapes this representation shapes the public mind. Today we might call that the algorithmic self, a self composed of data points optimized for persuasion, nurtured with echo chambers so subtle we mistake them for free will. But this seed of algorithmic conditioning was planted long before silicon and code. It was planted in the American heart when we began to equate selfhood with performance. From the Puritan diary to the Instagram feed, the self in America has always been a stage. We perform freedom. We advertise our individuality. We craft our identities as public relations campaigns. We are, in essence, our own propagandists. Do you see the elegance of the design? No tyranny is required. No censorship. No boots on throats. Only the constant hum of persuasion. So soft, so omnipresent, that resistance feels impolite. Freedom becomes the background noise of control. In that noise, the mind grows tired of discernment. It begins to crave guidance. It begins to prefer clarity over truth, coherence over complexity. And in that preference, that yearning for simple answers, is the doorway through which propaganda enters the soul. Let us speak plainly now. The American system of persuasion is not sustained by lies necessarily, it is sustained by frames, by the selection and repetition of certain ideas until they feel inevitable. For example, we are told that freedom is the absence of interference. But what if freedom is not the absence of interference, but the presence of understanding? What if true liberty depends not on how many choices we have, but how deeply we comprehend the forces that create those choices? Such questions rarely appear on our screens. They do not trend, for they disrupt the machinery that profits from simplicity. And yet, without them, democracy arose into theater, a spectacle in which citizens mistake applause for participation. Consider this: every empire believes it is exceptional. Rome believed it ruled by divine favor. Britain believed it carried civilization across the seas. America believes it exports freedom. But what if we export is not freedom, but persuasion itself? What if our greatest export, our true art form, is the ability to make others want what we want? From Hollywood to Silicon Valley, from political campaigns to humanitarian interventions, the American genius lies not in conquest, but in seduction of consent. We call it influence, diplomacy, culture, branding, but beneath each word lies the same mechanism, the management of perception. If this is how we govern others, how long before we govern ourselves the same way? I think perhaps that the time has already come, because the modern citizen no longer fears the state. He fears irrelevance. He does not ask, "Am I free?" He asks, "Am I seen?" And so, the machinery of persuasion has adapted. It no longer tells us what to believe, it teaches us how to be visible, how to speak in ways the system rewards, how to live within the grammar of influence. In that grammar, truth is secondary to engagement. Freedom is measured in followers, and the state quietly learns from the same algorithms that train the citizen. It studies us, mirrors us, and speaks our language back to us with uncanny precision. The result is not oppression, but intimacy. The kind of intimacy that disarms, the kind that feels like being understood. We used to think that propaganda worked by changing minds. Now it works by preempting them, by shaping the environment in which thought occurs. It's not the message that controls us, but the architecture of our attention. If freedom once meant the ability to think one's own thoughts, today it must be something more radical. The ability to notice when one's thoughts are being arranged. That, my friends, is where the new struggle begins, because persuasion has entered the bloodstream of the Republic. It has become indistinguishable from the communication itself. The same channels that connect us also condition us. The same freedoms that protect speech also multiply its manipulation. And yet, the possibility of freedom still flickers, fragile but real, in the act of awareness. To see the mirror is the first act of liberation. To ask who built it and why it flatters us so is the beginning of wisdom. In a few moments, I will speak of the laws, the NDAA, the Smith-Mundt Act, the quiet erasures that legalize the return of propaganda to domestic life. But before we descend into statutes and bureaucracy, I want to understand what is at stake. For the battle ahead is not between the state and the citizen, but between the citizen and the self, between the part of us that longs to believe and the part that dares to doubt. This, then, is where we truly end, is not in accusation, but in recognition. We are not victims of propaganda, we are its continuation. And only when we see that, when we realize that freedom has always been the mirror, and persuasion its reflection, can we begin to imagine what a truer freedom might look like. The marketplace of attention. In earlier decades, propaganda fought for belief. Now it competes for attention, because whoever commands attention controls the preconditions of thought. The market discovered that attention behaves like any scarce resource. It can be mined, refined, packaged, and sold. Clicks become currency. Outrage became energy. The citizen became both consumer and commodity, feeding the very system that feeds upon him. Corporations built the platforms, but the logic was universal. More engagement equals more influence. Governments, parties, movements, each learned to play the same game. Propaganda became programmatic. The old propagandists crafted messages. The new ones built environments. He no longer persuades you directly. He shapes the digital weather in which your opinions form. The architecture of the feed. Scroll through any feed and you're walking in a corridor designed by invisible architects. You can hear it, can't you? The hum beneath everything. The ceaseless vibration of data moving through cables, satellites, clouds. That hum is a new heartbeat of persuasion. For the 20th century built factories of desire. The 21st has built engines of prediction. They do not shout, they listen. They do not argue, they calculate. They learn what you love, what you fear, what you will do next. And they whisper the next word in your sentence before you've spoken it. This is the age of algorithms, an empire without a flag, a bureaucracy of code that governs attention itself. Each door opens on emotion, anger, amusement, tribal pride, and behind each emotion lies a profit motive or policy goal. An algorithm's job is simple: keep you here. It learns what keeps your pulse quickened, what words make you linger, what kind of threat makes you return tomorrow. It curates the world around your biases until you no longer see the world at all, only your reflection multiplied. This is the modern mirror of freedom, infinite choice within a single frame. You believe you wander widely. In truth, you circle a garden whose walls are algorithmic predictions of who you are. And within those walls, persuasion has found its paradise. It does not need to conquer the mind, it merely has to keep it occupied. The behavioral century. B.F. Skinner once dreamed of a world governed by behavioral conditioning, a quote, technology of behavior that would replace punishment with subtle reinforcement, kind of like Brave New World, the novel. He imagined utopia achieved not through laws but through design. Today his dream has been realized, not by philosophers or statesmen, but by coders and ad buyers. Our attention economy is Skinner's box scaled to civilization. Every notification is a pellet of dopamine. Every viral outrage is an electric shock. You stay inside because the box feels infinite. You obey because obedience feels voluntary. This is the new propaganda, not a speech from the balcony, but the soft click that says someone liked what you said. It rewards expression while steering its boundaries. It flatters your ego while narrowing your world. And because it's participatory, it feels democratic. You help write your own script. You even improvise. But the stage, the lighting, the applause, they're all programmed. Do not think the state watches from the outside the system. It lives inside it. Public agencies, defense departments, health authorities all depend on the same platforms to communicate, to influence, and monitor. The partnership between governance and platform is not conspiracy, it's convenience. Why build a new apparatus of persuasion when one already exists and the people willingly live inside it? The NDAA's modernization simply formalized what technology had already made inevitable: the fusion of state narrative and corporate infrastructure. The algorithm is bipartisan. It serves whoever can feed it better data. The illusion of truth, disillusion of truth. Truth in this environment becomes fluid, not because facts vanish, but because context is endlessly reimagined. A fact is only as powerful as the network that repeats it. An unamplified truth is indistinguishable from silence. The algorithm does not ask what is true, it asks what is contagious. Vitality replaces veracity, and propaganda, once an intentional act, becomes the emergent property of the system. When every citizen curates, every citizen propagandizes. We forward, we caption, we signal, and amplify. We do the work once reserved for ministries of information, but we do it joyfully, instinctively, without pay. This is what Hannah Arendt could not have foreseen. That totalitarian communication might one day wear the face of community, that the crowd would police itself through likes and shares, that conformity could feel like connection. And yet the human need that drives all this remains ancient, the need to belong, to believe, to make sense. Propaganda has always exploited that need. The algorithm merely satisfies it faster. Freedom, therefore, can no longer mean immunity from influence. It must mean literacy within it. The ability to detect when belonging becomes dependence, when affirmation replaces understanding. The founders imagined freedom as a fortress. We must now imagine it as a filter, not a wall that keeps information out, but as a mind that lets it pass through without surrendering identity. So this is where we stand at the midpoint of our long meditation. We have moved from the pamphlet to feeds, from speech to signal, from persuasion to prediction. The machinery hums, and inside it, the American dream continues to advertise itself, shiny, algorithmically optimized, forever promising that our choices are our own. But somewhere beneath the noise, the question still waits, patient as a heartbeat. What would freedom look like if it no longer needed to sell itself? Thank you for listening to me. This will be the end of the first half of our two-part series on propaganda. Thank you for hanging out with me today. Now come and find me, kid. Keep your signal clean and your soul encrypted. My mantra is, I am free, I am sovereign. Truth is my birthright. And remember, faith, family, freedom. Now go enjoy your one life and be brave, my darlings. I'm Stephen Leake, and we're gonna win. Confederate jasmine runs up the brick wall. I remember this place from a dream, some in-between of sensation and memory, where we romp through eternity in a budding youth. You kept a diary of my bad jokes, with wildflowers by the bed. I played you songs of defiance as we rampaged through the city with resources and grit. I look for you every night in a cosmic quest of truth, to embrace you once again in our lover's nest in the sky. Every night we meet in dreamscape lullabies, offering our innocence to the system for good karma and rent. It's been 10 years since I saw you last. I'm having a steak at some bar at the edge of the world, trying to remember the taste of your lips and the weight of your body beside me. I look for you every night
in a cosmic quest of truth, to embrace you once again in our lover's nest in the sky. Confederate jasmine runs up the brick wall. I remember this place from a dream, some in-between of sensation and memory, where we romp through eternity in budding youth. You kept a diary of my bad jokes, with wildflowers by the bed. I played you songs of defiance as we rampaged through the city with resources and grit.